Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's CLE, Disaster Rights, Resources, and Legal Ethics, how you can help those impacted by Typhoon Halong. I'm Leah McKenna, the Pro Bono Director for the Alaska Bar Association and Administrator of Alaska Free Legal Answers. I'd like to thank Emergency Legal Responders, Alaska Legal Services Corporation, and Alaska Institute for Justice for co-sponsoring today's CLE. So a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. Please mute your microphone. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and you can also add your questions to the chat, and we will try to address some of those questions as we go. Certificates of attendance and evaluations will be emailed later this week. And for reporting purposes, please ensure your screen name matches your Alaska Bar membership name. And a reminder that a digital copy of the program materials is available by logging into your member dashboard, and a link will be added to the chat to those materials. If you are interested in volunteering for disaster relief, we'll be talking about different opportunities later in this session. You can also sign up for the Alaska Bar Association's pro bono mailing list if you want to be notified about upcoming clinics about disaster relief, including the MLK Day clinics. And we'll put a link to that mailing list in the chat a little bit later. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have Caitlin Morgenstern, who is the board president and co-founder of Emergency Legal Responders and the Deputy Judicial Administrator of Court Access at the Louisiana Supreme Court. We also have Amelia Hoppy, the executive director and co-founder of Emergency Legal Responders. And we have Dr. Cheryl Musgrove, the director of Alaska Climate Justice Program at the Alaska Institute for Justice, and Joy Anderson, the co-director of the Community Justice Worker Resource Center at Alaska Legal Services Corporation. So I will hand it off now to Caitlin Morgenstern.
Myself since emergency legal responders. We're an organization that's based out of New Orleans, but nationwide. Can you hear me?
Caitlin, you're having some audio issues.
Now
it seems like we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I said this before, my computer had Microsoft 11 updates, and ever since then, it's been nonsense. I apologize. But emergency legal responders, we are based in New Orleans, and we work nationwide. I just wanted to introduce a little bit about myself so you know who you're talking to, and I'll let Amelia introduce herself. I'm a Katrina survivor, and I've been working with disasters since 2005. It's kind of why I went to law school. And Amelia and I co-founded Emergency Legal Responders because we saw the great need, especially after Katrina, on helping people navigate the complex framework of aid and federal response and state response after Katrina. And Amelia, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll go ahead and start sharing the slides.
Hi all. My name is Amelia, as you've heard, and I'm thrilled to be here. It's really cool to be meeting advocates from all over, and I've never been able to do work in Alaska, and so this is going to be kind of a fun learning experience also for me. I'm excited to get started.
Okay, and can everyone see the screen? Yeah, okay.
All right, so I'm going to get kicking this off. We're going to start with what is a disaster? Well, no, we all know what a disaster is, but we're going to start with the disaster legal needs timeline. So anyone here who's ever experienced a disaster understands that a disaster is pretty much every legal issue, but in an emergency sense. And so what we created at ELR is this thing called a disaster legal needs timeline. And I won't read it all off to you, but this is going to be a resource available. But these are things that we typically see in timeline format. So for example, in the first 6 weeks, we're seeing utility shutoffs, lease terminations, false evictions, emergency orders, things like that. And then we're moving into 1 month to 6 months, 6 months to 1 year, 1 year onwards. And really the point of this is saying that to kind of bring it home that a disaster may be one day, a couple days in like the media's mind, or like even what is considered a natural event, but it has generational impact. We are still at ELR helping people with cases from Hurricane Katrina, and that's been over 20 years. So it's just something to keep in mind as we're going through the presentations today, is that things that you might not be like, oh, this is relevant right now, it probably will be relevant at some point in the future.
Okay, and next, the Alaska Institute for Justice is going to talk a little bit about some Alaska specific issues.
Thanks, Caitlin. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, okay. Cheryl Musgrove, I'm with the Alaska Institute for Justice, and I'm the director of the Climate Justice Program. So it's important to know first that there's various levels of declarations. There, for this current disaster, we have federal, state, and then tribal and city level declarations. This list here just gives you some of the cities and tribes that have applied or that have made disaster declarations. And so they have the right to make their own disaster declarations. If you go to the next slide, we will see that both FEMA and the state have also made disaster declarations for Typhoon Halong and the October 2025 storms on the West Coast. The period is from October 8th through October 13th. So this slide here shows you the different areas that are covered by the state and the federal disaster declarations. The state has 8 different areas, eight boroughs or REAAs. Those REAAs are areas in the unorganized borough of Alaska. So the unorganized borough is where there is no borough. And as you can see from this slide, that the FEMA disaster covers some, but not all of those areas. But it's really important to tell people and to remember that even though some of the areas are not covered right now under the federal disaster declaration, the state is trying to work with the federal government to get that expanded to cover all of these areas. And so please tell people, apply, even if you're not currently covered, apply for federal relief. Certain areas should be selecting the Lower Kuskokwim REAA as part of their application, but other areas should just go ahead and apply, like the North Slope Borough. Go ahead and apply even though it's not currently under FEMA. And then as soon as, well, if you go to the next slide, the FEMA guidance actually says to do that. The FEMA guidance says if a county or place has not been added yet, to go ahead and apply. They can't process your application, but then as soon as that area is included, then they can process the application right away. And then they do have specific guidance for some of the areas in Alaska to apply under the Lower Kuskokwim Regional Educational Attendance Area.
So
You're cutting up, Caitlin. I'm sorry.
oh. Okay.
There you go. Much better.
Okay. I think we might have just an issue this entire time with my microphones. But anyway, my question for you is, so here in Louisiana, when there's a disaster, a lot of times you can report damages to your local city or government. And when you report damages to your government or the state, that shows the state that there is more of a need for a federal disaster declaration. Is that the same process in Alaska?
Yes, that's why a lot of the cities and the tribes applied for, or they made their own disaster declaration, and that helps support the state in getting a disaster declaration from the federal government. And so I don't know if the local governments are still or the local tribes are still doing those, but if they have not done that, they should do that. They should go ahead and do their own disaster declaration to help support the expansion of the declaration to cover all the areas covered by the state. Thanks, Caitlin. Good point. Next slide. And then this just shows the deadlines, the current deadlines for individual assistance applications, which are IA is the short for that. So for FEMA, the deadline is 30 days after the federal disaster declaration. So that was on November 22nd. So the deadline is currently December 2022, 2025, just over a month away. The state is hoping to get an extension of that deadline, but it has not been granted. So people should plan to apply by that December 22nd deadline. And those links there show where you can go to look for an extension, but again, don't count on it. And then the state has granted a one extension of 30 days. So the state IA application deadline is now January 9th, 2026. If you are working with people and you see the need for additional time for people to get their applications submitted, please advocate for that. Call the state, call FEMA, call the governor, or call the representatives of your state and federal government and just say, hey, you need to pressure them into giving more time. That's especially true, I think, for the FEMA application deadline, because that's coming up pretty quickly. Next slide. And then the other deadline to keep in mind is for appeals. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that people from the impacted communities are very likely to, when they get a denial letter, to just walk away. They have a tendency to just give up and walk away. And so we really need to encourage them to apply for an appeal or to file an appeal. Because mistakes are made and some of the reasons for denials that we've seen from the past are not valid for Alaska. They apply different standards than should be applied for Alaska. And so the deadlines for appeals are 60 days after the denial or the decision letter. So that's either a partial or a full denial. So 60 days from the date on the FEMA decision letter, or with the state, 60 days from the date of the state's written decision letter. At the state level, you can request reconsideration. That reconsideration request has to be within 30 days. And then if you do request reconsideration, then after that decision on the reconsideration, then you have that 60-day period. One thing to keep in mind is that you're going to want a complete copy of the file before you file. Whoa. Are you guys getting echo too? Caitlin, I think that's what it was. So you want to get a complete copy of the file, the FEMA file or the state file. So you want to do that as soon as you come into contact with the client. You want to request a copy of the file and request an extension of time to file an appeal, because it will take some time to get that file. So you have a complete picture. And I think Caitlin will talk more about that when she gets to it in her slides. Next.
Cheryl, can I ask a question about that? So can you talk a little bit about the difference between a request for reconsideration and an appeal?
Yeah, the request, if we go back one slide there, the request for consideration, I wish I had the standard right before me right now, but usually it's based on, I think it's just a second bite at the apple. I can't remember the difference in the standard, and I should have had that before me. But generally, if you're requesting reconsideration, it's, you need to show that there's something that was either wrong in the decision, that they overlooked some evidence that you submitted. You may have the opportunity then to supply additional evidence. I know with Murbach, one of the I did both, I would do both if necessary, but usually on reconsideration, I would get past the barrier that was there. And so, for example, one of the examples I like to give is a subsistence camp, which we'll talk about later. But they granted relief for a subsistence camp based on the number of people in the household. While some subsistence camps, several families use that. And so there may have been 10 people using the same camp, but only 2 people in the household that own the subsistence camp. And so on reconsideration, we said, would you reconsider this and give more money? Because here's these declarations from, 8 more people who use this camp. So that's the type of thing I would do on reconsideration. On an appeal, hopefully by the time you do the appeal, you've got all the information before them. And then you can just say why it's wrong based on the record before the appeals decision. And Anne, I see that question. No, reconsideration is not required for an appeal. It's just an additional step you could take. Next slide. Another thing to keep in mind, and I think people from Alaska are very, very familiar with this, but we're dealing with different cultures, and a lot of time you're dealing with most of the people in these villages are Alaska Native. They are a member of a tribe. The tribes in these communities are sovereign entities. And then also on top of that, sometimes you're going to have 2 governing entities in these villages. You're going to have both a city and a tribe, and some just have a tribe. And so that's something to keep in mind that can come up in things like getting a certification of ownership of a home, for example. You could probably go to either of those governing entities because the tribe is a governing entity and a sovereign. Also, you need to keep in mind that these villages are remote. There's no roads in and out. We're familiar with that in Alaska, but another thing to consider about that is that means that the cost of replacing something in a village is going to be much higher than the cost in Anchorage. So it's going to probably double the cost, if not more, to get a snowmobile, for example, out to a community. So that's really important to keep in mind. The people from these remote villages, they have their own culture. They are usually subsistence based. They have a norm of being very self-sufficient and resilient, but also very community oriented. They may be reluctant to ask for help for fear, and we've had someone already say this, well, we don't want to take away from relief someone else might get. And so you need to keep all of these factors really in mind when you're helping them with their application and encouraging them to submit an application or to file that appeal. And keep these norms in mind because our FEMA programs are set up for the typical Western culture, and our villages are not set up that way. And so when you come across a barrier that doesn't fit with what happens in villages, we need to try to figure out solutions. And one thing that we'll talk about is, for example, you may be by FEMA required to get a contractor estimate. Well, these villages don't have contractors in them. And people can't afford to fly a contractor out from Bethel to their village to get an estimate. And so those are the types of things you just have to figure out ways to get around some of the barriers that come up with FEMA. Next slide. And I was just looking at the question there. Yeah. Another thing to keep in mind that the disaster survivors, they have to fill out all this paperwork. They're not used to filling out paperwork. They're confused. They may have had someone come into their home and do an assessment, And they may think that that assessment is all that was needed for them to apply for assistance. And that's not true. They have to apply to both FEMA and the state. And so you just need to make sure that the people you're talking to, they may have thought they've applied for assistance, but they may not have. And so you may have to follow up with them to figure that out. Another thing is, these are subsistence-based communities. They have spent their entire spring, summer, and fall gathering food, and now it's gone. Their whole year's worth of food security is just gone. They can't just go to the grocery store. Those that have been evacuated to Anchorage they don't even have access to their traditional foods. So they're really, really suffering through the trauma of not only the disaster itself, but then being pulled from their community and plopped in the middle of an urban environment that they're not used to. They've lost their homes, their communities, their way of life, and they're being asked to now adapt to this totally different environment that they've never been in before, other than just to visit. So, next slide. Finally, really important to remember is the right to language access. These, most of the people on the YK Delta anyway, English is not their first language. Yupik or Cupik is their first language. Further north, it may be Inupiaq, maybe their first language. And so they do have the right to language access, both under the Civil Rights Act and under the Stafford Act. FEMA policy also requires the provision of language services. And go to the next slide. And although that right is there, actually having it provided is a different issue. The agencies are obligated to provide these language services, but they don't always do so. And many people in these villages, they may speak English, but that's their second language. And so it's really difficult for them to understand, even though they're proficient. They may sound proficient, but they don't understand the concepts. And FEMA is complicated, the FEMA process is, and it's really hard for them to understand what is necessary unless it's in their first language of Yupik or Cupik. Some suggestions for helping them assert their language rights is to, first of all, in their application itself, make sure and have them write down, or you write down at some point, someplace in there that they need language services, that their first language is not English. Every time they're on a phone call with FEMA or with the state, assert that right to language access. The likely response is, based on my experiences, we don't have an interpreter available. And so if that happens, the next best approach is to go ahead and assert that right, but then to also have either a family member, a friend, or someone else that's available to help them understand some of the complicated concepts. Sometimes it just takes having the person just slow down and use more understandable terms. We attorneys tend to use legalese a lot, and that is not understandable. And so just slowing things down and just listening to them and trying to say, use just more basic terms is sometimes all that's needed. But again, always keep asserting that right to language access, and then ask for a follow-up letter or email from either FEMA or the state, whoever you're talking to, summarizing what they need to do so that they can get someone else to help them. The attorney can help them, but maybe someone in their family can help them as well. Next slide. And these are both FEMA people, but these are some people you could contact to ask about language access. I've talked to them already, and they've asked me, like, well, what specific community member needs language access? And they've indicated a willingness to help out. So these are two good contacts to have. Next slide. And then we put this together kind of to maybe convince people why it's so important to go ahead and apply for individual assistance. First, it's their right to get relief if they've been impacted by a disaster. And also remind them that it's not competitive. By them getting disaster relief, that's not going to take away from someone else. That's not going to take away from their neighbor who they think may need it more. And another thing that we experienced more recently is it really does support long-term recovery funding for these communities. It's not just right now, but long-term. We just had a recent HUD community block development grant opportunity come to the state for people impacted by Typhoon Merbok, which was in 2022. And they're distributing that money based on applications received from Typhoon Merbok. So those communities that didn't get as many applications but were impacted really harshly by Merbok aren't going to get the relief again. And so it's really important for people to realize the importance of getting applications in for long-term recovery as well as immediate recovery. Next slide. And then really important, and this is especially true here where the state disaster was declared before the federal disaster, is that you have to apply to both the FEMA and the state to get complete relief. If people apply just to the state, they're going to be excluded. They will not get relief. They have to first exhaust those FEMA benefits before they become eligible for the state. And I know the last I looked, there were a lot more state applications than FEMA applications, which really worries me. And so we need to make sure that that everybody applies to both programs, both state and FEMA. Some people were concerned that they're going to get in trouble because they've applied to two different programs, and we just need to assure them that they work together, that the state and FEMA make sure that there's not duplication. Next slide. Okay, that's it.
Thank you so much. That actually was great. And now I have all these interests. Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. I'm going to get started talking about just FEMA claims and the appeals process. So this will just be federal. We're not going to be speaking about like Alaska in particular, but there will be some examples from our experiences. So, of course, FEMA overview. It's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Hopefully everybody here already knows that. And it's a federal agency responsible for coordinating disaster response and recovery efforts. And FEMA's mission includes supporting communities, assisting with recovery efforts, and coordinating with other agencies that are on the ground. Next slide. Okay, so this is the disaster declaration structure right now, and that is to trigger FEMA assistance as a major disaster must be declared by the president. The key points include that only the governor of the affected state or chief executive of impacted Indian tribal government may submit a request for a major disaster declaration. And of course, the term state includes District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. This is kind of a helpful graphic for those of us that like seeing it all laid out. And if we are happy to like share this with anyone who's here, if you need to just explain like a basic process, but you can kind of see like the event and then what the process is and why it can take a while to get anything moving. Okay, so FEMA and disaster declarations. The declaration itself designates the type of programs and assistance that were going to be available. So assistance is not just individual assistance, it's pretty much everything. So it could be public assistance, which is for government entities or for nonprofits. not for nonprofit businesses, but for those 501(c)(3)s, and then individual assistance. So individual and household assistance, which we'll be talking about mostly in this presentation. And I did want to mention this because this is actually what Cheryl was talking about earlier, which is that disaster survivors, we encourage them to report their damages to the state or territory in the hope of triggering a disaster declaration. So for example, one thing that we've been very successful at is we were into Moss Point, Mississippi, and we put a sign up like at the grocery store where everybody was getting their groceries. The whole town was decimated. And we sat there and I ate boiled peanuts for around 7 hours and just was like, hey, you have your phone, you have nothing else. Let's just call on the grocery line. And we were able to get enough people. They had been rejected 4 times. We had enough people call in and we got a disaster declaration. So it can be that you have been rejected and you're able to convince them otherwise. Versus in Slidell, we weren't able to get enough people. So that is like my one time it's been really successful. So there's hope. Next slide.
I'm going to chime in to say, like, some of that you have to consider like the size of the area. So like Moss Point, Mississippi is a more rural area. And so like the damage of households there versus the amount of people living in that area versus so Slidell, Louisiana, that's like a suburb of New Orleans. It's a lot more urban population. So they're just in terms of the scale, there just wasn't enough households damaged to trigger a disaster for FEMA purposes. But we'll talk about SBA later. And in Slidell, they did have a disaster declaration so people could get SBA loans, but not FEMA grants.
So this disaster, it's this is the number that this DR 4893AK. If you're going to be helping anyone, I encourage you to put it on every piece of paper you submit. You have it plugged in your memory. Do not mess it up because it will easily get lost. And this includes what we're going to be speaking about today. So several storms. The official incident period spans October 8th through the 13th. And there was different declarations depending as things happen. So it's like as more areas get included into the FEMA declaration, that will change. And as you can see, it was first declared a state disaster, and then later on was declared a federal disaster. And you can go to like on the FEMA website or on there we go. Wonderful. You can track all the FEMA updates. So here we can go see right here, and they'll just keep adding places as more things get decided as a place that's going to be getting assistance. But you do need to make sure that it's like what kind of assistance is being added, because you'll think that they have individual assistance, but maybe they haven't reached that threshold yet. So.
And this is the web page that's very helpful to look at for all updates. Like they will post news releases if there is an extension of a deadline. They will post everything here. Like FEMA sometimes just like buries things. It's a little bit convoluted. There won't be like a spot that says, here is the deadline. You might have to sift through some press releases. So just keep that in mind. But remember the declaration date, because that declaration date is the date that you have to keep in mind for when assistance period starts.
Caitlin, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, this is from the FEMA handbook. I just included this. It's basically the sequence of delivery. We don't have to kind of go through it, but I thought it'd be helpful for people to see in FEMA's mind what the disaster assistance sequence of delivery is, where you're looking at initially assistance from volunteer agencies and insurance, then federal assistance might be available. And first you see the housing assistance, then you see other needs assistance, then you might look at an SBA loan, then some people might apply for FBA loans and some people not. I also wanted to point this out because this is in the 2025 guide that FEMA has, and this is outdated because FEMA did updates in 2024 that you don't have to apply for SBA anymore. And I just want to point out that even though this guide is great, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And I just updated this in July and it's not up to date. Okay.
Okay, so individual and household program assistance provides financial assistance and direct services to eligible individuals and households who have uninsured or underinsured necessary expenses and serious needs. So this is the thing that most of you all are going to be working with, and that is the keyword individual assistance. It is, you can look at the specific questions, you can check out FEMA's policy guidelines and like what exactly it consists of, but we'll be going into more about like what that includes.
And keep in mind that assistance periods for FEMA are normally 180 days. And so that's 180 days from the date of the declaration. So that means for like 180 days, FEMA will provide housing assistance. They will provide assistance that might be extended.
Yes.
But just keep that in mind.
For example, they were able to get it like extended in Maui. So like after in the fires, they were able to get it extended like by 3-month increments mostly. So let me do. Okay, so what is housing assistance? Housing assistance is money for temporary housing when unable to live in home. That could be in the form of rental assistance or reimbursement for hotel costs if there are hotels available. It's also transitional housing assistance, also known colloquially as FEMA trailers, if trailers are able to be in the area, and then repair or replacement for owner-occupied primary residence. And then other needs assistance. When we're going through these documents, you might see it as O and A. So just so you know, the acronym gets thrown out a lot. But other needs assistance is assistance to damage to personal belongings and household items, damage to essential vehicle, childcare expenses, medical and dental expenses, moving and storage, and then serious needs assistance, which I'm sure is something if you were working with people that who've already put in their application, if they're really going through the process, this is like the first distribution of money. So this is something, it used to be called critical needs assistance, and now it's serious needs assistance. And that is usually disaster specific. It's a one-time payment. You cannot appeal it. So if you get denied it, you can't appeal it, but it is the one that comes through usually first. And that's to cover things like water, food, diapers, etc. The amount of financial assistance an individual or household may receive under individual household under the IHP is limited. FEMA adjusts the maximum awards each fiscal year based on the Department of Labor Consumer Price Index. But as you can see, it's not very much. And this is something that is really important when you're working with a client or someone who is in need, because it really is amazing that we're still only giving a max of 43,600 for housing assistance or 43,600 for other needs assistance. So it's not a lot. Maximum financial award. So financial housing assistance and other needs assistance have independent and equal financial maximums. The maximum financial housing assistance applies to home repair and home replacement assistance. And so that's that 43 that we were just looking at. And then temporary housing assistance includes, these are different programs. So this is really important to know. So that is just like for home repair, home replacement, but then the temporary housing assistance includes that lodging expense, reimbursement, rental assistance, continued temporary housing assistance. And these are not counted towards that 43,600. And so people often get confused and think that like it's all eating away at that, but it's not. So you can get both. And any insurance payments do not count against the maximum award, but you do need to go through the insurance first. So accessibility assistance, this was a big thing they really focused on after the 2024 change. Oh, I'm sorry, Leah.
Oh, no, go. I'll just ask when
I see a hand. Okay. And that is disaster caused losses to accessibility related real personal property for qualified applicants. And this is with a disability or other access and or functional need are not subject to a financial assistance maximum. So these are like, they now are counting it as like a separate payment, which is great. And it's now applies to accessibility items currently awarded under home repair assistance and personal property assistance. So, Leah?
There's a question in the chat. Does that housing assistance include compensation for individuals who open their homes for survivors to live on a temporary basis?
I'm sorry. I guess I'm having so it's if
You saying like
like
someone would get paid by FEMA to house people?
Allison, if you want to unmute yourself and clarify your question.
Yes, there are a lot of people in Anchorage who are opening their homes for people from the villages to stay so they didn't have to go to an emergency shelter until they could get more better housing arrangements, but it's going to be a long time until they can get back to their village. And so I'm wondering if those individual community members in a different community who have not been affected by the disaster but have opened their homes to survivors, are they eligible for any kind of compensation?
I don't believe that I mean, I've never seen that. They actually actively like if you evacuate and you go stay with your family or you go stay with friends, that's not counted as any kind of housing or lodging that should be getting any kind of award. I don't know if there would be anything different maybe this time. It'd be an argument, maybe because there's like special cultural needs, but I have not seen that. Unfortunately.
And I'll echo that too, Amelia.
Yeah.
I don't think that there's anything available. I know that people are reaching out to the BIA because they have people staying with them, and just the way that BIA said is the people who have been evacuated and are staying with family are very happy there, but the family themselves who are housing the extra people are like, what do we do? And there's no assistance that the BIA knew of to help them either.
And in the chat, there's a response also that a workaround would be to execute a short-term lease and run it through the rental assistance program.
I was just about to chime in to say that, like, FEMA will provide, after you have the temporary housing, you can get housing if you need long-term housing through a lease. So that might be one way to get a workaround. And I guess FEMA would call that a border, which we'll talk about later.
Oh yeah.
Which is like a term I feel like people don't use anymore.
It haunts us, but we'll definitely talk about it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I just put this in there so you could kind of see the different categories of grants, and how they square and how, you know, home repair and home replacement don't count against other needs assistance, you know, temporary living assistance, and so on. And that's good to know.
You also can see how many programs there are. So, and then we'll go into another one. So this is rental assistance grant. So this is money to rent alternative housing. This is that 1 to 3 months. The monthly amount is through the fair market value. Up to 1 month's worth of assistance may be used towards a security deposit. That was another big change and update that they made recently, like to get more attention on because people were having to pay security deposits out of pocket, which really didn't make a lot of sense. And they may be used to pay utility costs if the costs are part of the rental charge, which is also great. Home repair grant. So this is for underinsured damages. It has to be your primary residence. And of course, that has been, they will really go after if it's not your primary residence. So for example, like they consider secondary residence or and it's just something to really keep in mind when you're having anyone do an application because they will, it's, you just are like, where do you get like your mail? Where do you live most of the time? And you might have to sometimes like file more paperwork to prove that. Money for repairs may not be used for improvements or additions to the pre-disaster condition of the property unless they're required to comply with local and state ordinances or eligible mitigation measures. This is so important, and we'll talk about FEMA asking for money back later, because you need to be able to show continuity of the property being restored, not in a way in which is considered having an improvement. So I'm not sure what happened. Oh, I thought I might have gotten kicked out.
Hey, Amelia, can I add
Mhm.
something onto that? I will,
Please.
during conversations with the state regarding some of the most impacted villages, if they build back in place, that's kind of a question still up in the air. If they do build back in place, FEMA has indicated that they would allow for raising the homes to a safer level. And so I just wanted to add that on there because they may have to raise them up to get high enough to be safe from future flooding.
Yeah, and they changes. No, thank you so much for mentioning that, because that changes like depending, like they'll that's a it's interesting because like it really is very who you're speaking to, what disaster you're working in. So like for Typhoon Mawar, they were like they didn't want anyone to raise the property, but then enough people were like, this doesn't make any sense, and outside people came in and like made recommendations and things like that, because they considered everything island housing, which is its own problem. And it got enough attention on it. And so now they did allow like a special program to let people raise their homes, but it's all also depending on what that maximum award is. So how much are you able to raise it? But no, thank you for mentioning that. This makes sense. Okay, so the home replacement grant. This is very rare. We're hoping to see this available more, but this is when you can essentially purchase a replacement residence or apply the grant towards purchasing a more costly home. And these are difficult to get. And we've had some success with them, but they don't happen very often, and you have to have a lot of documentation on like why you need to move and how you're not able to improve your home. Okay, so personal belongings replacement grant. This is great for homeowners and renters. If the other source didn't cover all expenses damages, you can apply to cover the difference. So these are for any kind of your different belongings. Yeah, that one's a hot one. It's a hot grant people love. And temporary housing unit grants. So usually in the form of mobile homes, depending on where you are. So for example, they didn't really do this in Maui or in Guam, but they often bring mobile homes to places that are on the mainland. I don't know what it will be like in Alaska, but FEMA only provides trailers when eligible applicants cannot find temporary housing through rental assistance, and they will only authorize trailers in response to a request from the state or tribal governments in some disaster impacted regions. So there has to be a request to get these.
Amelia, there's a question in the chat. If there's a decision to relocate villages, how does this implicate any new builds in the new location?
I mean, I don't know. Has anyone been successful with a large amounts of relocation and new builds?
So if they're gonna relocate individuals, that's gonna be under like a whole separate program,
Yeah.
and there's gonna be other considerations. It's not just these FEMA grants. They're gonna look at like buyouts and home building costs or home relocation costs. It's like a whole separate program that considers like all the individuals relocating. They did that in some areas in southern Louisiana recently to locate some tribes out of wetlands that were, shrinking. So you have to consider these other programs as well if you're thinking about relocation.
And it can take a while to get that. like any of the relocation grant money. Okay, so these are for those temporary housing units that I just was speaking about. So the maximum amount of time is 18 months. After that, FEMA will charge rent. They will. The governor may request an extension. For example, they did that with Hurricane Ida. It was successful. Rent is fair market value, and FEMA will only provide, in my opinion, 15 days notice of the termination and specify the reason of the termination, the process to be followed on appeal. You are required when you're living in one of these units to verify status every like 30 days. The person will get a call or they'll need to be filing something or sending some paperwork in of their continuing eligibility as long as their long-term housing plan. So they usually have to be working with someone to make a plan on like what happens when they leave the unit. So this is in FEMA in 2024, there was a bunch of updates. So this is really important, especially for anyone who's helped people with FEMA before or has had to deal with FEMA before, is that it's actually really different now. And serious needs assistance became critical needs assistance. It's really it's that immediate check. So for example, a $750 check, $1,000 check, it's really determinate. The amount is determined based on the disaster, but the overall is that it aims to help cover those immediate expenses, sheltering, evacuation, meeting basic household needs, the things I spoke about before. And you're not able to appeal it. So, but it is that first distribution. And then displacement assistance. So aims to provide upfront funds to assist with immediate housing options for survivors who can't return home. And this is something in which, it's for staying with friends and family until they're able to secure housing, but friends and family can't apply for it. So it has to be the person who's been displaced. And then just through the FEMA grant timeline, of course, first is that serious needs assistance. And then after that, we get into lodging expense reimbursements. Every receipt, and I encourage people, of course, take photos of it, but like if you can keep like the actual physical receipt, it really is helpful. And then rental assistance, and then temporary housing assistance. And then of course we get into subsequent awards as more time goes on. And that's those home repair and replacement, personal property, home repair accessibility, and other needs assistance.
So this is just to keep in mind when people are getting the initial letters.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be everything that they are eligible for.
Right.
It's going to take some time to get to the home repair, replacement, the personal property, because FEMA inspectors might need to come out for that. But the initial awards will include that serious needs assistance, the lodging expenses, and so on. And then later on, you might get more funds for rental assistance and so on. So just keep that in mind when people are coming in with the initial applications.
Okay, so this is the 2024 program update that we were the most excited about, and this is no more SBA loan application is required. I can see Cheryl shaking her head. It's true. It was wonderful. Previously, it was this wild system where FEMA required some applicants to apply for SBA loans automatically, even if they were going to get rejected before they were able to go through and get through applying for FEMA. This requirement has been removed. It's great. Caitlin will talk more about SBA loans later, and so you'll learn all about it. And then also really emphasizing that like insurance is not a barrier. Previously, if survivors received an insurance payout up to the federal cap, they were ineligible for FEMA, and now they can get funds if repairs cost more than this cap. So that was also a really great update. The standard FEMA registration period, as we talked about earlier, is 60 days after the president declares a disaster for the designated area. It starts on the day IA was designated for the declaration, and this is the time period where people may file for FEMA grants. If granted, types of assistance will be available during the 18-month declaration period. So all those different things that we just went through. And that's, of course, the current deadline, which is December 22nd, 2025, but it may be extended. Applicants have a 60-day grace period to complete a late application for FEMA. So I encourage people, no matter what, we want everyone to apply, but even if the time is like getting to the end or they're not able to have everything together, just make sure they put in that application. According to a new update, when a late application goes in, it still is going to get reviewed. FEMA may send a letter asking the applicant to provide justification for the late application, and the applicant may call the FEMA helpline or submit a letter explaining the extenuating circumstances that prevented them from applying for assistance in a timely manner. If submitting a letter, the letter must be signed by the applicant or an authorized individual. And we've seen this successful. Yes?
So just to interrupt for a second, because this question was asked in the chat, for folks who've been displaced, they're unhoused in a shelter, whatnot, how do checks or benefits are distributed, and how are they receiving the information? Because I know you said FEMA may send a letter asking the applicant, but can you follow up on how the information is passed to those the survivors if they're or the beneficiaries if they don't have maybe a current address?
So when they're applying for any kind of FEMA distribution, they're going to have to put an address. So they'll put the address of wherever they're living at the time. So often it's like you put the emergency shelter's address, or you need to have some kind of address to put in your application, and that's where you'll be getting notice. And that's where you'll be getting any kind of checks. Or you can also do like a direct deposit or things like that. But
Yeah.
And
Apply online. They'll get the notices online through the disasterassistance.gov. And there's also an app. And I know not everyone is well versed in using the internet and stuff, but that's another way where you can get
Little
updates.
And also, I just wanted to add for those that were evacuated from like Kipnuk and Quig and some of the other villages, they have been receiving mail at the Egan Center here in Anchorage. They've just been forwarding mail from their PO boxes and stuff to the Egan Center, so people are able to get their mail here.
A follow-up on that, if they apply initially by mail, can they update an address through the app or through the website, or switch and do, appeals and so forth, or do they have to stick with the same method throughout the process?
You don't have to stick with the same method. And we'll talk about this as long as you'll get an application number when you apply. And so like if you do it over the phone, you'll get that application number, and then say someone comes into a clinic and maybe they applied over the phone, you can sit with them and create an online account, walk them through it, and put in that application number, and their information will pop up.
And we recommend that. We recommend that you redo that, because that paperwork gets lost so fast, and they will definitely say that you never sent it in. 100%. And so it's way easier to have kind of that train of evidence being like, oh no, I definitely filed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but also making sure when you're scanning anything or taking any photos that the pictures are clear, because they also have had a tendency in the past, the FEMA system, to have glitches and things like that. So just make sure you really great about that. So late application circumstances, these are just some that have been successful that we've been able to use. So hospitalization, incarceration, ongoing domestic situations for persons in household when there's like a threat, major life events. They include the initial registration period. So you gave birth or things like that. And so these, we've seen some success. I don't know if anybody wants to add any other ones that have been successful for them.
And Leah, we were talking about domestic violence situations, and this is a specific example where if a survivor might need to apply late for a FEMA application and might need to do so separately from their abuser, they can have this late circumstance file their own application and be successful. Okay. And so now I am going to go on to talk about, those are all the FEMA grants. So who is eligible? for FEMA. You must be a U.S. citizen, non-citizen, national, or qualified alien to get a grant. Um, if you aren't a citizen and you live in a household with a child or another family member that is a citizen or has a social security number, you can apply. You have to live within the disaster affected area. There's no income eligibility. For homeowners, like you can only apply for the primary residence, and only one person per household um, may apply. And that person in the household will include all people in that household on the application. I went the wrong way. So I know you guys don't necessarily have that many immigrants in Alaska we talked about, but some information on who is a qualified alien. And if you are, you'll be asked to sign a declaration and release form. If you're undocumented, like I said, you can apply on behalf of a minor child or an adult family member who's living in the household. Um, People who are undocumented, they're not eligible for cash assistance, but they could maybe get non-cash assistance or eligible for other state and local assistance. So common application issues that we see when people are applying for FEMA is lack of eligibility because they do not meet one of those eligibility requirements, like they aren't a citizen, it's a second home, they're not in the area. Incomplete or missing or incorrect information, like the application wasn't fully completed. Multiple applications from the same household. They didn't include proof of loss documentation, and they missed a deadline. And this is for initially when you're applying, these would be things where someone is applying and like the application just doesn't go through. And they might be applying online and it just doesn't go through. And then if that happens and someone comes to you for assistance, you might need to call with them on the phone to talk them through with FEMA some of these issues.
Caitlin, if I can add on, also in these remote villages, they don't have physical addresses. And so that's going to be another barrier. They may live, the address that they may have may be 500 feet past the post office. And so a lot of times those applications will get rejected because that's not an address that the system is recognizing. So just kind of be aware of that. One of the ways to get around that I've found sometimes works is by looking at their driver's license or their tribal identification, if it has an address on that, using that exact description of the address.
Good to know. Thank you.
No, that and yeah, and actually that's true because that also happened in Guam. They don't have like formal addresses, and so there we also use their identification. Like if you use that exact address and it was successful, but yep. Anyways, just wanted to reiterate, you're right.
Okay. So when an individual or household of individuals applies for FEMA, you have to verify occupancy, for rental assistance and all the other types of assistance, and ownership if you're going to get any of the home repair assistance. And so this is probably one of the biggest issues is how people are going to demonstrate occupancy and ownership. And FEMA has certain accepted types of documents for occupancy and ownership, including utility bills, employers' documents, leasing, housing agreements, and such. One thing I want to point out, if individuals do not have these typical bills and such, they can get a letter from a public official verifying occupancy. They can also use affidavits of residency, letters from schools, letters from other benefit providers, letters from social service organizations, And one thing that was added after Hurricane Ida was a statement from a mobile home park owner. And so this was a big issue after Hurricane Ida that people weren't able to prove occupancy in mobile homes. And so in 2021, FEMA did some updates with that. Ownership verification. Ownership also needs to be proved. There are various type of documents that need to be accepted from typical deeds and such. For multi-generational homes, for homes where there might be a title issue, um, will or affidavits are able to be shown. You can also have a public official's document letter. You can have receipts for major repairs. And I will point out that AIJ has created a guide, and in their guide, they have an appendix for a self-certification for home ownership. So they have that in the guide that people can use to certify homeownership. And so that is a great resource.
And Caitlin, I'll add into that I happened to be at a conference last week. And I asked actually the BIA put on a presentation because a lot of these homes in these villages may not be through like the probate process and stuff. And so that's another situation that may come up. There may not be a deed, or there may be a quitclaim deed that was in the name of someone who has passed away and it hasn't gone through probate. And so again, that's going to be super helpful to have that alternative that's either self-certification or certification by a public official in the community that this, to their knowledge, this is their home. Because according to the BIA, they're like 6 years behind on getting through probate. So it's not going to be done anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. And like, honestly, I think the number one issue that Amelia and I see whenever we do appeals clinics is people with title issues relating to proving ownership. And so it's great that you can now do that, and it's great that AIJ has these templates that attorneys can use to make it easier to help prove ownership. So the shared household rule. So FEMA expects members to remain together post-disaster and submit a single application for their household. This is their shared household rule. So this means that when there's one application for an address, all subsequent applications will be flagged and denied. So applicants must apply as their own household. So what happens if like you aren't in a household and you're in a roommate situation? If there's roommates, the subsequent application may be denied. You will have to probably, this is what we do, get on the phone and call FEMA, explain the situation that you're roommates, and then provide a copy of the lease or other documentation showing the occupancy. This was something that went into place after Hurricane Katrina because of all the fraud claims. They just automatically deny when they see the same address. So just keep that in mind. And one person can be a household, multiple people can be a household. It's an interesting terminology. And normally, individuals have to have flood insurance to get a FEMA claim, but I know that in Alaska, this might not be required in certain areas.
Yeah, I'll address that, Caitlin. But to go back to the household issue, something
Mhm.
that's going to come up in the Native communities here is that a lot of times there's multiple families living in the same household because of housing shortages. And so
Mhm.
that is, I know that's going to be coming up, and is what we've been telling people is just apply and then let FEMA kind of figure it out with you guys. You may have to submit additional documentation, but it's just really complicated in the villages. But
Mhm.
turning to flood insurance, it is not generally required in remote Alaska villages. Number one, there has not been a survey by FEMA to do a floodplain analysis, and so that analysis is not there. Another reason is that some of these, because I indicated earlier, this is an unorganized borough for many of these areas, And if it's an unorganized borough, there's not the borough level to provide the required ordinances for flood insurance. And there's not sometimes a city available. And so that's another reason that there's not necessarily a flood insurance program requirement. And so in general, this is not going to be an issue in remote Alaska villages. They're covered by this declaration. So that's it.
If I can just interrupt for just a second, we had a couple questions come in about the head of household and what a household is. What is the head of household? What if the head of household did not include an adult household member on the application? And then the second question was, what is the definition of a household?
So the household individuals living together under one address.
We can't hear you.
Caitlin, can you repeat that? You were kind of.
Oh, I'm so sorry for my technological difficulties. Mercury is doing something right now. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So a household is individuals living together at the same address, mailing address.
Mailing or
Um,
physical address?
it should be like so like there might be like a house that might have multiple mailing addresses, like there might be different apartments. So that would be different households. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm thinking like in most villages, they don't usually have really
Oh.
multifamily apartments. So they have a house that may have multiple families living in it, the same.
Mhm.
That's going to
Yeah.
be just a single household, right?
Right. That would be a single household if they're living together. And if they are a unit that would evacuate together,
Right. That's exactly what
then
Caitlin
they're
just
a
said.
household.
Yeah.
If
And that's when
they're like a unit that would evacuate, say there's like two families and maybe they'd evacuate separately, you can treat those as two households and apply separately, but you might have some issues where the first one that applied will go through and the second claim won't. So that's why FEMA usually says everyone in one household apply together to prevent the kickback, but it's possible to get the other ones through. So keep that in mind. It's not just like where they're living, but how they evacuate and what that plan is after.
and I do want to reiterate what Caitlin said, which is like, so myself and my cat are a household. It's just me and my cat, as you now you all know. But like we are a household. Caitlin and her daughter are a household, and so you can make the argument, especially that evacuation argument has been like a good one to prove that like you are your own unit, even though you live in a similar, if you live in the same structure. So.
Okay. And so there's various ways to apply for FEMA over the phone, app, online. And I was told there's not DRCs at disaster resource centers at this time, but FEMA has been in the area helping with applications. So when someone applies for FEMA, they'll have to provide their name and social security number, address before and after the disaster, current contact information, where they can be reached, a mailing address, names of everyone who lived with you before the disaster, your household, any insurance information. For some reason, you still have to provide your income before taxes, even though that has nothing to do with that. Income is not an eligibility determination. You provide a description of the damages and the losses to your home, car, any injuries, medical expenses, and so on. And you provide your account information for direct deposit. After you apply, if you're not applying online, keep in mind, so you'll apply and FEMA will direct you to provide documentation to them by a certain date, either by uploading it, fax, mail, giving it in person to verify ownership and occupancy, identity, damages, and insurance information. And so it's necessary to follow up with these documents or the claim is going to be denied. After that happens, and a FEMA inspector is the FEMA inspection process if the claim goes through. They'll call to arrange a visit. They will ask the applicant to sign a citizen declaration, and they will examine the property to determine if it is, quote, safe, sanitary, and functional. This is what FEMA's definition is. It's very subjective. And they define safe and it as safe and secure from disaster-related hazards or threats to occupants. Sanitary is free from disaster-related hazards, and functional is capable of being used for its intended purpose. And the inspector will like go through and like literally ask questions like, does your dresser work? Does your refrigerator work? Does your lamp work? And you'll have to answer yes or no. So FEMA is visiting impacted communities. If you're in a rural area and unable to meet with an inspector, there's some ways to try to get around this. You can write first if there's someone else maybe in the area, you can authorize someone who's 18 years old or older to meet with the inspector on your behalf. 2, you can try to request a remote inspection. And then if your home just cannot be accessed, you can try to arrange with FEMA to meet with them at a neutral location to verify occupancy and ownership and try to submit photos of the damages. Okay, so when they're determining whether a home is safe, sanitary, and functional, they look at the exterior windows, the electricity, the interior's habitable areas, including the ceilings and floors, that a home is capable of operating for its intended purpose and it's safe to access to and from the home. And as I was saying, in our experience, this is pretty subjective. And we've seen inspectors where they'll say, like, you have a kitchen that works with a roof, so that's safe. Or you just have a bedroom, so that's safe. But just keep that in mind.
And Caitlin, if I can add something in here specific for Alaska,
Yeah.
remember that things like an Arctic entry is essential in Alaska, and you may have to argue that and appeal that. But there are things that are essential in Alaska that may not be essential elsewhere. Another thing is in some villages that don't have running water, they don't have showers, so they have makis, which are steam baths, and that's the equivalent of a bath or a shower. And so that maki, if it's damaged, then they're going to need, that's an essential aspect of the home. And so there's specific things that maybe that FEMA should take into account, but you usually have to appeal it to get that coverage.
Thank you. And so common reasons that we see for FEMA denials are first, that they cannot prove ownership and occupancy. And what you do in the appeal is provide the adequate documentation with that, the information that we listed out previously. You might have to do a self-certification or an affidavit. 2, the initial report did not have adequate damage. And so that you would have to provide proof of the damage with photos, potentially a contractor's estimate. There's insufficient damage or the home is safe to occupy, and this would be based on the FEMA inspection. They would have to determine that it was unsafe to live in. And so again, you'd have to provide photos and make a case that the home is not safe to live in. Another reason for denial is relocation. So on the FEMA application, there's a box that applicants have to check that says asks if they're willing to relocate. And this is a little bit confusing because a lot of people think that this means that they have to move. That is not what it's there for. It's willing to relocate because their home is damaged and they're not able to live in the home. So relocate temporarily. So if people don't check that box on the initial application, it will be denied. So keep that in mind. Again, I said multiple applications from the same household. That's a very common denial that we talked about. And another common denial is if it's a secondary residence. Another common reason is insurance. But now, as we talked about, uninsured expenses or underinsured expenses are now covered. And so you just have to prove that your damage is more than the settlement. Another common reason that we see for female denial is identity theft. So somebody will apply on behalf of somebody else and basically steal your identity. The way that we have found to get around this is submit to FEMA an identity theft affidavit to contradict this. And in that, you should include the social security number, address, driver's license, phone numbers, a statement that the person was a victim of identity theft, the date the identity theft was discovered, how it was discovered, and have that notarized and submit that. Okay, so appeals. Prior to 2024, all appeals had to have a letter accompanying with supporting documentation. You no longer need a written signed letter to appeal, but we always strongly suggest it because it allows you to explain what's happened and why it should be appealed. And so the appeal process. Appeal must be made 60 days from the date on the decision letter. And to appeal, we suggest you write a letter with the applicant's full name, address, and phone number, have them sign it. You always include the FEMA registration number on every page. You always include the FEMA disaster declaration number on every page. And if the FEMA applicant doesn't write the letter, include a statement that they're authorizing you to write the letter on their behalf and include supporting documentation. This is just an example appeal letter. And probono.net has a helpful appeal letter generator that you can access if you need access to it. And so what do you need to do to support an appeal? You need to have photographs of the damage. If you can't have that, statements from neighbors or government officials who know about the damage. Receipts or other financial documents showing when damaged items were last replaced or repaired. And it might not be possible, but it's always great to have a contractor sign estimate showing the cost for the damage. You need pictures, receipt. Yeah.
Caitlin, on that contractor's estimate, we do in the AIJ stuff, we do have a supplement for that, a template for a request for waiver of that, and a certification from a government official saying about the cost of the estimate and the damage. So just FYI, because there are not contractors out in these small villages.
Yeah. So that is good to know because FEMA's going to ask for that. And so you can go to the AIJ guide and get the template and use that with at clinics or with clients if they're being denied because they need a contractor's estimate. This is talking about that. Leah?
There's a question in the chat to just clarify that with an appeal from a denial, you can supplement the record with evidence you didn't previously submit. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and with reconsideration, you could do the same. I guess reconsideration is only in the state process, right? Okay.
Yes. And so appeals can be submitted to disasterassistance.gov. That's probably the easiest method and quickest method, but they can be faxed and mailed and submitted to DRCs if they're available. And so appeals, they usually take 30 days, but they may take up to 90 days to hear back from FEMA on an appeal. You can use disasterassistant.gov to track the appeal, and then always submit additional documents if FEMA requests them and send them as soon as possible to support the appeal. So this is like a long, I always say it's like a long haul. It's gonna take a while and people might get discouraged because it's a long process and it's confusing and you might be told wrong information, but persistence is key. You can just keep appealing. And you keep providing documentation and appeal and appeal. And I hate that, you might just have one person that might not understand the process or might be looking at something wrong, but always appeal. We already talked about this. Okay, and FEMA tips. So keep receipts and tell clients to keep receipts for everything that they're spending with FEMA money for 3 years. FEMA can attempt to recoup assistance within 3 years of when it is receipts. So keep those receipts to show that they are used for what its intended purpose. And so only use benefits for the specific purpose. So like rental assistance, only use that for rental assistance. Home repairs, only use that for home repairs. Don't go out and buy a TV. I've seen people who have done that. So keep that in mind. Some common FEMA questions we get. FEMA benefits are not considered taxable income. They are exempt from garnishment, and they're not considered resources or income for other needs-based assistance, such as SNAP and Medicaid and disability. I see a question from an
Hello, my name is
Hi.
Rachel Delahanty. I'm an attorney with Alaska Legal Services based in Fairbanks, but I supervise the Bethel office. You said that FEMA benefits are exempt from garnishment, but we do have one case where the client had a loan on a snow machine. The snow machine is gone, and she had talked to the loan company and they had said, you know, okay, we'll stop your automatic payments. And then she got the 750 immediate assistance from FEMA, and then they took it. The loan company took out like $400 out of her account from the FEMA money. So
That is an interesting situation that we haven't ever seen before. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes, I'm also an attorney at ALSC. Rachel's my supervisor, and I'm working on that case. And that client, through no fault of her own, a big chunk of her $750 payment was used not at all for the purpose it was intended for. So I don't know what FEMA might think or do about that, and also what recourse she might have, other than job owning the lender.
So just to clarify, the lender garnished the FEMA checks that came in and utilized it to pay for the machine that was broken?
She bought the machine just before the typhoon, and she signed a financing agreement so that uh, the lender associated with the snowmobile dealer was going to, for a bunch of months, take out $400 a month from her bank account automatically.
So
then
like auto pay.
yeah, and then the typhoon came, and she lost her job and home and snowmobile, and relocated to Bethel, and called the finance company and asked them to pause her payments. And according to her, they agreed, but they didn't actually do it. Then she got $750 from FEMA, and then 400 of that disappeared when the automatic payment came through.
This sounds like it's just an automatic payment. It's not an actual garnishment. So if
Right.
for it to be a garnishment, it would have had to go through the courts.
Right.
So I think she just needs to have a conversation with the bank about how to stop this and maybe move her money to a different bank account. But she will have to prove to FEMA that she used her FEMA funds to do what they were intended for. Otherwise, she'll be subject to a recoupment, which is what I'm more concerned about.
Yeah. The company, the finance company, agreed to not charge her payment in December, but that's as far as they.
And they're not willing to refund the last one since they accidentally pulled it without permission?
They weren't when she called them. I haven't spoken with them yet. We'll see.
They may, knowing that there's an attorney coming on board to help out. But I would
Right.
push for them to come and pull it back since it was FEMA funds.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you look at it's 44 CFR section 206.110G. But that is the regulation that has the exemption for garnishment for FEMA assistance. So you may want to, I guess, talk to the lender and provide them that information as well.
And if they won't refund that money, she may end up having to refund it to FEMA, apparently. So she'll be hit twice in a sense.
No, not exactly. She just needs to figure out like money's fungible once it hits your bank account, right? So she just
Yeah.
has to figure out that she spent $700 towards whatever FEMA gave it for. So if it was for rent, then she spent 700 for rent somehow, right?
And that was that 750 serious needs assistance.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so she'd have to show that she spent it on like gas, diapers or like anything that would fall under that serious needs assistance.
So she needs to replace that money herself somehow.
Yeah. And practically speaking, they're not going to come after SNA. SNA funds are just for, get your life together, get your food, get your shelter, like Caitlin said. So the likelihood that FEMA comes after this is very low.
Okay.
But she should definitely use that leverage to get that money back from the lender.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, people who are incarcerated may still qualify for FEMA if they are going to be released before the end of, I deleted, end of the assistance period. And so they would need to submit official documentation from the correctional facility or provide the necessary information for the release date. And if they can't be present for a home inspection because they're incarcerated, they can designate someone 18 years or older on their behalf to deal with the inspector and assist them with the application. But they are, in terms of their assistance, it's for items that are damaged at the residence, not items that may have been damaged if they were in a facility that was in the disaster area and like may have flooded or if their personal property items in the facility were damaged. So crowdfunding and FEMA. This has been an interesting kind of trajectory over the last few years. Um, Amelia, do you want to talk about this or do you want me to go talk about crowdfunding?
I mean, you can talk about it. It's really, I feel like it's ever changing.
Yeah, so I think it was in 2022, we received a request from Hillbillies Helping Hillbillies in Kentucky wanting to know if crowdfunding affected your ability to receive FEMA assistance, if that was going to count as like another assistance that would prevent you from receiving FEMA. At the time, we kind of submitted inquiries, various inquiries to our FEMA contacts, and at that time, they determined no, it would not. Last year, or was it this year? Were the LA wildfires this year?
This year.
It was
Yeah.
this year. I can't keep track of time anymore. So with the LA wildfires, FEMA changed their policy. I think they saw that there was like a real big rise in GoFundMe platforms and such. Um, and so their stance is that FEMA doesn't provide aid for needs that are already covered. And so large crowdfunding donations may affect eligibility, but the guidance is if you're going to do crowdfunding, keep it very broad. Don't say specifics. Don't say like my car was damaged in the typhoon and I need money for my car. Don't say that. That's too specific. Just keep it very broad. And if you do that, then it's more likely that you will still be able to receive FEMA assistance and FEMA won't be able to tie, anything that you received in the GoFundMe to specific, like fixing your car or fixing your home. So just keep that in mind. SBA loans. And so survivors no longer have to pay to apply for SBA loans, but these are something that are available after a disaster, and it's not just for businesses. Individuals can get disaster loans. And so these are available and they cover losses that aren't covered by insurance or FEMA, whether personal or business related. And types of loans are physical damage loans, mitigation assistance, economic injury disaster loans, and military reservationist loans. And businesses of all size can apply, homeowners, renters, and nonprofits. And when they're looking at if you're eligible, they look at your credit history, ability to repay, and collateral. For SBA loans, you have to be in the declared disaster area. And one thing to keep in mind with SBA, there's a presidential declaration, which covers SBA and FEMA. But sometimes in some areas, there's no presidential declaration and there's just an SBA agency declaration. And then people won't have FEMA eligibility, but there will be SBA loan eligibility. And when it comes to those two different type of declarations, some of the requirements are different. So when there is a presidential declaration, the collateral requirements are only $14,000 versus if it's an agency declaration, a collateral requirement is $50,000. And so, as I said, collateral is one thing that you have to keep in mind. And one story I have about this is from an individual in Texas, and she was applying for an SBA loan to help with assistance with a trailer. And they were telling her that she needed $50,000 in collateral. But it turned out that the SBA had put the wrong Texas storm number on her storm. And it was actually a presidentially declared storm, not an agency declared storm, so she didn't need as much collateral. So that's something to keep in mind. And so for the SBA loans, homeowners can apply for up to $500,000 to replace or repair their primary residence. Renters and homeowners may borrow up to $10,000 to repair or replace personal property. The first payment's deferred for 12 months. There's no interest for the first 12 months. And for applicants who are unable to obtain credit elsewhere, the interest rate norm doesn't exceed 4%. Its maturity is up to 30 years and there's no prepayment penalty. And so you can also, like FEMA has a website where you can search for a disaster. The SBA, you can search for a disaster declaration. And this might be a case where in some areas they might end up doing just SBA assistance and not FEMA assistance. Okay. All right, and now we're going to talk a bit about the state program.
Thanks, Caitlin. So as I said early on, people need to apply to both FEMA and the state individual assistance programs because they cover slightly different things. And to get complete relief, they have to apply to both programs. And again, they have to apply to FEMA first to exhaust FEMA before they can get state assistance. So like FEMA, they have housing assistance, ONA, other needs assistance, and then those temporary housing grants available after they exhaust the FEMA availability of funding. And there's just some information. DHS and EM is who manages the state program. Alaska's pretty unique that we have this program because a lot of other states don't have their own disaster program. They rely entirely on FEMA. So go ahead, next slide. And I did just put in the chat that DHS and EM has put out 2 inconsistent dates for the deadline. One says January 8th, the other says January 9th. And so I would go with January 8th, which is 30 days from the previous deadline for submitting applications. I don't think I need to really recover this. It's very consistent with the FEMA. Some of those Alaska specific considerations, and sorry, I didn't realize we had a separate slide for this. So Arctic entries and steam houses, though it's Maki, those are essential in remote Alaska communities. Those Arctic entries are not just porches, they really are essential to the safety and heating of homes. We, for Typhoon Merbok in 2022, we had to do some appeals to get that covered by FEMA, but they did end up granting the appeals and giving coverage to get those repairs done. I already talked about the Maki, and just make sure and you make those uniquely Alaska arguments in these cases where they've been denied by FEMA. I'm hoping that FEMA learned last time and we won't have to, but this is probably going to come up. Next slide. Another really unique Alaska thing is transportation and subsistence gear and equipment. You know, boats and four-wheelers and snow machines, they're not just recreational. This is the mode of transportation in a lot of the communities. They're not recreational, they're needed for subsistence, they're needed for safety. They're the mode of transportation. You know, make sure you get the note, make the year, make, model of it, and then if applicable, covers personal property, just like the FEMA program. And then the uniqueness of Alaska again is, and FEMA may or may not cover some of this stuff, but is subsistence gear and equipment and structures. FEMA will not cover, I guess go to the next one. FEMA won't cover subsistence cabins. They consider subsistence cabins to be second homes, even though us in Alaska know that's not true, that these are essential. They're part of what is a household. But FEMA just cannot cover those. And so the state has fortunately stepped in and will cover subsistence cabins. But again, even if people don't have damage to their home, they can never get to the subsistence camp relief unless they have applied through FEMA first. So they have to apply to FEMA. And there is a separate form for people to fill out for those cabins. So that's really important to make sure that people mark on the state application that they have subsistence cabin loss or subsistence, some kind of a subsistence structure, and get that separate form filled out. A lot of times, and this came up with Murbach, people may not know until next summer or even next fall whether they have damage or loss of a subsistence cabin because it's way off in a different area. They need to apply now, even if they don't know if there's damages, and they can always withdraw that application later, but they need to apply right away within that deadline. I mentioned this before, subsistence camps may be used by more than one household. If that's true, the state provides relief based on the number of people using it. So I think last time it was 3,500 per person in the household. So 2 people, that would be 7,000. But if 10 people, a couple different families are using those, you want to make sure you maximize the relief. And we do have, again, in our help, our little booklet we put together, we do have a form for people to fill out that use the cabin that may not be part of that same household. And so just make sure and get all the evidence in there that's showing how many people actually use that subsistence camp cabin to maximize the compensation for the loss. Next slide. We went over this already, but deadline 60 days after the governor declares. The state's now saying January 8th in their press release, but the website itself says January 9th. I would say, let's say January 8th just to be safe. Again, just like the FEMA, if you show extenuating circumstances, you can submit a late application. The state does require that you do show that. It's probably a little bit more strenuous standard than the FEMA. Just like the FEMA, keep track of everything. There's the information there to apply. And speaking of FEMA, there is an Alaska-specific FEMA hotline too. I don't think we've mentioned that. I think that's what's in the slides though. The state appeal process requests reconsideration first. That has to be in writing within 30 days of the written denial. You have to submit that additional information showing that you're supposed to show was not initially available, or that the state's decision was an error. Just submit it, even if it was initially available and they just didn't submit it. Just submit the additional information. And then the appeal within 60 days of either the initial denial or within the 60 days of the denial of reconsideration. And they have a pretty quick turnaround time, supposedly, on the appeal. I don't know that they always stick with that. Next slide. And then for the communities listed on this, there are what the AVCP, Association of Village Council Presidents, provides various services to some of the communities on the YK Delta. And they have what they call community navigators that are in the listed villages here that were impacted by the typhoon and the flooding. And so you could reach out if you have a question or need to connect with someone, or you're having problems getting in touch, you could reach out to these specific people. I don't have their names, I just have their phone numbers, and ask them for assistance in the village, like reaching out to somebody if you got a wrong number or whatever, if you just need some guidance or need to make a connection. These are people you could reach out to. Next slide.
Well, we're gonna quickly go over the importance of legal ethics in disaster scenarios. As we know, disasters create chaotic environments, and we have seen a rise in scam incidents and including attorney incidents and bad actors. So we wanted to put this on everybody's radar. At ELR, we've also created a common disaster fraud timeline based on our experiences, like the legal need timeline. So this is something to keep in mind from the first 6 weeks to 1 year onward, that different scams and frauds may take place, from donation scams, phishing scams, price gouging, to contractor fraud, identity theft, predatory rentals, and so on. And so we've also seen a big rise in misinformation, disinformation, and rumors, and how these are affecting people's ability to, one, apply for FEMA, and two, navigate the disaster recovery landscape. And so when we're looking at misinformation and disinformation and fraud, we see things that might be nationwide scams, where we see these in all areas. And we see things like charity scams, contractor fraud, and price gouging pretty much happen after every disaster. Then we'll see different localized and targeted fraud that take advantage of specific vulnerabilities of populations. So for example, one thing that we saw, this was after Katrina, we saw this. We saw this after the Maui wildfires. There was rumors that if people applied for FEMA, that the federal government would come and take their land. And this prevented people from, they were scared and they didn't apply for FEMA. And so that's something to keep in mind, especially in Alaska, where people might be wary of the federal government, rightly so, to encourage people to apply. And then we also see misinformation, disinformation, and rumors really going rampant on social media and misleading people who are basically already in crisis. And so I wanted to point out, misinformation is wrong or misleading information, and that's unintentional, versus disinformation, and that's false information that is spread deliberately to manipulate the public, and it's politicized. And so we've seen in our experience different categories of misinformation and disinformation, and just want to point this out. So as you're experiencing this disaster, what to look out for. So in terms of political disinformation, an example that we saw and was after Hurricane Helene was disinformation coming out from our president about FEMA raiding donations, FEMA running out of body bags, FEMA running out of money, FEMA diverting money to illegal immigrants. This caused a lot of confusion after Helene. Another category of misinformation is misinformation that we have seen from historically oppressed communities, and these communities kind of trying to explain or figure out a way, like, why did this disaster occur? So an example after the Maui wildfires was, there's a conspiracy that the fires were caused by laser energy directed weapons that bounced off roofs and caused the fire because they wanted to have a corporate land grab. After Katrina, there was a rumor that the levees were blown up intentionally to displace community members. And then Amelia will go over later on. The third category we see are disaster predators, disaster capitalism, people taking advantage of people who are in a difficult situation. And so keep in mind now, as everybody's navigating this landscape, that Google and other engines are no longer reliable. They have these algorithms that can be manipulated. They have the advertisements first. And this we are already seen to cause a problem. So an example that we've seen here in Louisiana was one of our legal service corporations, Acadiana Legal Service Corporation. Somebody Googled them, and instead of going to Acadiana Legal Service Corporation, clicked on what they thought was Acadiana Legal Service Corporation, but it was a scam, and they put in their information because they thought they were providing their eligibility information to see if they were eligible for the services, and they had their identity and information taken. So keep that in mind. And we've seen not only that, but fake shelters, scam emergency loans, predatory professional services. And so there are these fake websites and Instagram ads and things that are coming out that make it look like they are government services when they're actually coming from predatory professionals. And this is just an example of misinformation and how, like, after many different storms, if you can see, after this one was from Florida, one was from Houston, Texas, one was from Hurricane Matthew. This is the same picture of a shark, and people are sharing it in all different situations. There was also an AI generated image in Alaska. And so, as legal service advocates, we need to be aware that this is happening, and so that we can communicate with clients, we can try to steer them in the right way, and we can provide them with skills and tools necessary to try to navigate this landscape. And we can provide them with, good information, and instead of letting them fall prey to some of these disaster scams. And so Amelia is going to talk more about why this is important.
Hi, y'all. So I got a message also that we're running out of time. So I'm going to be pretty fast about this because I'm pretty sure you all know why this is also important. But it's those tailored legal strategies, to protect clients based on unique disaster contexts, enhancing effectiveness, enhanced client protection, to prevent similar scams from learning from specific disaster fraud cases, and effective fraud prevention. Developing targeted education. So relevant laws and regulations that I think are really important for you all to know, and you can investigate more later, is of course the Stafford Act, which created the framework for federal disaster aid with fraud prevention measures, FEMA regulations, guidelines, and penalties to prevent fraud and disaster relief, and of course disaster fraud statutes, which are federal laws targeting fraud, including mail, wire, and false claims. And there's state level protections, and these include consumer protection laws, contractor licensing, ensuring only qualified professionals handle repairs, and of course, specific disaster fraud laws for the state or territory. So the American Bar Association has a former ethics opinion, and it's ABA Formal Opinion 482, which is ethical obligations related to disasters, and it lays out the specific ethical duties on the part of the legal practitioner. So this is really helpful if you're kind of getting into a gray space. You can go use this as a reference point. And of course, the key ethics. These are the ones that really are the most dominant, which is this, competence lawyers need the knowledge and skills for disaster-related cases. Do not help someone with a case, even though you want to, unless you have actually been trained or are learning about this area. Confidentiality, protecting clients' information during disasters, conflict of interest, managing conflicts to maintain trust, and then, of course, communication, which is one of the hardest things during an active disaster, which is, making sure that you're communicating with your clients. There's the Alaska Rule of Professional Conduct governing guidelines and law. So, which is just Rule 1.1 for competence, which is what I've spoken about before. The confidentiality of information. Oh, I don't know if the Alaska Bar Association, do they want to be talking about this, or should I? Okay, I'll just keep going.
You can talk about it, Amelia, and I'll just point out that all of these Alaska rules of professional conduct are identical to
Right.
the ABA model rules, with the exception of Rule 1.6 is just worded slightly differently, but otherwise they're identical.
Great. And 1.4, which is that communication that we spoke about before. Okay, so this is the really important thing for those attorneys here in this room, predatory disaster attorneys, with the governing Alaska rules of professional conduct. I don't know if Alaska Bar wants to mention any of these things in particular. No. Okay. So this is, of course, charging excessive fees to disaster victims, aggressive solicitation of clients without genuine concern, making false promises about legal outcomes, filing meritless lawsuits for profit, misrepresenting legal services, false advertising, unethical billing practices, and poor communication with clients. This is growing. And so this is really important because this is getting more attention. So just make sure you're reviewing this when you're working with anyone. And okay, well, one of the biggest ones recently has been the MMA case, McClellan, Mosley and Associates, and that was recent. That was a Houston law firm specializing in hurricane lawsuits. It expanded. They went from Houston, they expanded into Louisiana post 2020 and 2021 hurricanes, and signed up around 15,000 homeowners. And I don't know if Caitlin wants to talk about more because she actually works the Supreme Court. So, Caitlin, that was your case.
Sure.
Yeah, you love it.
So this is interesting. This law firm partnered with a roofing contractor to go out and knock on doors so after hurricanes, a lot of people have blue roofs where the roof were damaged. They knocked on doors to sign people up to get roof repairs and unknowingly also signed people on for this law firm. They also relied on aggressive communication techniques, sending over 1.1 million automated messages, text messages, letters. I got them to my house and signed on over 15,000 homeowners. And the reason that this all came to light was a lot of the claims for insurance claims were filed in federal court, and the federal judge noticed that this one law firm filed like 3,500 claims in one day and was like, what is going on here? And it uncovered this crazy scheme that we had never seen before. And so the Supreme Court had to step in. First, the law firm was fined by the Department of Insurance. The Supreme Court stepped in. The attorneys that were barred in Louisiana are now suspended and under a disciplinary procedure. Their trust accounts were frozen. A receiver had to be appointed to help all figure out this mess, to help all these clients. They were barred from collecting legal fees on any of these claims. And a lot of these people are still navigating their insurance claims and still haven't had their insurance funds from these hurricanes that happened in 2020 and 2021. And we just like to point this out as something that, like, something could go totally wrong. And what the interesting thing was, this was from an mostly out-of-state law firm that came into Louisiana and acted as a bad actor. And so we just really have to be wary of people who want to prey on our disaster vulnerable populations. And so keep in mind indicators of predatory practices. So like alleged free legal services that end up requesting payment for information. This is something that I know Amelia saw when she was working in, I think, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Like automated boilerplate client communications, promotion of a sure thing, like a sudden influx of identical case filings and complaints lodged by disaster victims. And I just wanted to put this up as an example of two different ads that I got after Hurricane Ida for two different programs that look like they're government programs, but they are not. When you click on them, they were from a law firm. And like, so I know this as an attorney, but a lot of people might not realize this because of the names of what these ads are. And Amelia's going to go quickly through some other disaster predators.
I mean, one of the largest one, of course, are contractors, and those are contractors take advantage of disaster survivors and make a profit. We see this often through charging inflated prices, offering unnecessary services, leaving work incomplete. Give me half now. I'll come back later. Things like that. It's really important to get multiple quotes, verify the contractor credentials, make sure that they're registered. It's really hard to go after like fraudsters. I mean, I'm sure as everybody here knows. And so if you try to just, I mean, it's always, you're going to be seeing people who have already been defrauded. So it's really just right now, it's kind of just like getting that information out. Like if you're going to be signing anything, have a paper copy, be communicating with someone, have some kind of evidence and trail. Fake charities. These are horrible and they're happening more and more. And those are scammers posing as legitimate organizations to collect fraudulent donations. So claiming to raise money for disaster victims, pocketing the funds instead, and unsolicited donation requests, lack of transparency. And so protecting yourself, of course, is like making sure, using GuideStar or something like that to make sure it's a registered nonprofit. But there are a lot of really wonderful like mutual aid and community groups that also deserve support. And so just balance that and use your best judgment. Phishing scams. This is happening more and more. These are cyber criminals who use fake emails or messages to steal personal financial information. It's that it's like at gmail.com or it's like FEMA help. You're looking at really the end of those things. It's like instead of .gov, it's .com. And so sending fraudulent emails or text claiming to be FEMA or other agencies, asking personal details. I've gotten these and really just try not to click on suspicious links or, advise people not to do that. And really call FEMA. If you're doubtful, just call and find out. Because this can really send people down the wrong road.
And Amelia, if I can add something here,
please.
So because so many people applied to the state and not to FEMA, the state has been sending the information on to FEMA, and then FEMA is calling people. And my concern is people are going to either
think it's a fraud,
scammed, or they're going to think it's a fraud. And so what I've told people is just take their name and tell them they will call back on the hotline number to connect with them. But just kind of FYI that really concerns me that they're taking that. I understand why they're doing it, but they're taking, and it looks like Red Cross is texting and emailing. And it's just like,
No, I mean, it's totally fair. Yeah,
yeah.
And FEMA people always have a badge ID number. So always.
But how do they know that's legit, Caitlin? I mean, anyone can say they have a badge number. I mean, yeah, the scammers are pretty sophisticated.
I mean, it's funny because now, of course, anyone can get a lamination machine. And it used to be like oh, wow. And now it's like, I have one. So, and then price gouging. And so, of course, there's usually like within the state or territory, there's some kind of like law or ordinance. It's like, okay, this is price gouging. We saw this a lot in LA. But these are sellers or service providers who take advantage of demand spikes by inflating prices of non-essentials. And this is usually right after the, the disaster. But, that's what you think for like essential goods, but then those essential goods you'll see the spikes in rent, you'll see the spikes in like, putting your kid in daycare and things like that. So it's just something to be aware of. And okay, I guess that because we wanted to wrap up so everybody had more time. And this is our org, emergencylegalresponders.org. So contact us if you have any questions. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Amelia. So hi, everyone. Again, I'm Leah McKenna. I'm the pro bono director, but I also am the administrator of Alaska Free Legal Answers. Next slide. So Alaska Free Legal Answers is our virtual legal clinic. It's available 24/7, and this is a nationwide project of the American Bar Association. So 42 states and territories have a similar site. And so basically, the way it works is low-income Alaskans can ask 3 civil legal questions per year. The vast majority are family law questions, about 40%. And then volunteer attorneys log in, they preview the questions, and they answer the question if they know the answer and have the ability to answer it. Volunteers are not obligated to answer questions. So if you're a newer attorney or you feel like you're just getting started in this disaster relief category and you're not sure if you're comfortable yet answering questions, you can preview questions before answering them. And this is what the main website looks like. You'll see that button sort of in the middle top there where it says attorney registration. If you're interested in volunteering, that's where you would go to register. It's a very simple process. And next slide. So when disaster strikes, as it has here in Alaska, the Alaska Free Legal Answers is modified slightly. So we have now a raised income and asset cap, which will allow us to serve most people who apply or post a question here for assistance. We can also use out-of-state attorneys. So we have here in Alaska Bar Rule 43.6. And Kara, if you could put in the chat the link to our website about where people can find information about that. But basically, if you are admitted and in good standing from each jurisdiction where you're admitted in some other state, you file a simple application and we can get you approved pretty quickly to be able to help volunteer. So you have to volunteer with a qualified legal services provider, which includes Alaska Free Legal Answers. It also includes Alaska Legal Services Corporation and most of the nonprofits here in Alaska. Also, during a disaster, we have disaster-specific categories. So there will be a disaster category related to just FEMA appeals. So after today's presentation, you know probably much more than the vast majority of attorneys out there about how to do a FEMA appeal or a FEMA application. So I encourage you to subscribe to volunteer on this site, subscribe to that category at least, and any other categories that you feel like you would be able to answer questions in. And so we do have these modifications to the site now, and also we had it during the 2018 Alaska earthquake, and we did get quite a few out-of-state attorneys at that time too. Unfortunately, we did not get that many local attorneys, many Alaska attorneys helping with those disaster categories. So we're really hoping to mobilize people this time around. Next slide. So the clients on Alaska Free Legal Answers, they have to be over 18 years old. The typical guidelines are that they're less than 250% of the federal poverty guidelines for income and less than 10,000 in assets. But right now with the disaster, they have to be less than 400% of the federal poverty guidelines for income. So for one person, that's about 78,200. And for a household of 4, that's 160,760. And then the cap for assets is they have to have less than 250,000 for disaster relief. They don't have to prove their income or assets. They just have to, click on an attestation saying that they meet those guidelines. So we think we will be able to serve a lot of people with this site. And our guidelines are much broader than Alaska Legal Services. So for anyone who's over income, this is definitely a great resource for them. In addition, people need to not be incarcerated. It can only be a civil legal question, not a criminal one, and they need to be unrepresented. Next slide. So to get started with Alaska Free Legal Answers, again, you just go to the website, which is also linked there, and you click on attorney registration, you follow the prompts. I just check to confirm you're in good standing, and within a day or so, you're able to start answering questions. We will have training resources available, but I encourage you to just download the materials from this presentation, which there are many of them, including really detailed resource guides. So it might be daunting to look through all of that right now, but if as you answer questions on Alaska Free Legal Answers or with Alaska Legal Services, those are really great reference materials for you to look at. And so I encourage you to do that. And in addition, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you are interested in volunteering for clinics, we do have that pro bono mailing list that you can sign up for if you want to volunteer at either the MLK Day clinics, or there's a possibility we might also do a clinic before MLK Day to help with FEMA applications and appeals. So you can email me or just go to that form. It's in the chat near the beginning of the chat with the link to the pro bono mailing list. And I think that's it for my slides. Let's see, next slide, we'll see what happens. Yes, okay, I'm gonna hand it off now to Joy Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening. My name is Joy Anderson. I'm joining you from the Alaska Legal Services Corporation office in Bethel, and I work with our community justice worker and pro bono programs. Let's go to the next slide. I'll try to go quickly in case we have time for one or two questions at the end. Alaska Legal Services is a statewide provider of free civil legal aid in Alaska. We have 10 offices around the state where we serve all of Alaska's communities. And I saw that there are colleagues from ALSC from at least the Kotzebue, Fairbanks, and Juneau offices on the line this evening as well. We serve clients for a variety of different civil legal issues. There are a few listed here on the screen: consumer protection, housing, disaster legal assistance, all of which were touched on today by Amelia, Cheryl, and I'm suddenly blanking on Caitlin's name. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks. Leah mentioned eligibility guidelines, and ours are a bit more restrictive than Alaska Free Legal Answers. So generally, we can help individuals who are below 125% of the federal poverty level for their income. But there are some exceptions to our income limitations that depend on an applicant's location, ability to access legal information, and also cost of living in the community, which most of you know can be extraordinarily high in some of our rural communities. So when informing people about the opportunities available for them, please encourage them to apply for our services. If they're not sure they might meet the requirements, and if it's determined they're unable to, we can refer them to other resources. There's also flexibility for seniors who are 60 or older and above 200% of the federal poverty level, where we may still be able to help them also. So again, you can encourage them to apply. Our asset limitations or eligibility guidelines are $15,000 or less for the first household member, with an additional $5,000 allowance for each additional household member. And that excludes primary residence, vehicles or equipment used for subsistence, your primary vehicle, and a few other things as well. So again, you can encourage people you come across to apply, and we'll help them determine their eligibility. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. I'm not going to go through all of the different categories where we can assist clients who have been impacted by a disaster, some of which were touched on the presenters today. I will go ahead and note that we are going to be assisting eligible clients with FEMA appeals and IA appeals. That's definitely something, and I think Kara has Rikara has linked our flyer already, which has the information on these slides that has the full range of legal issues that we can assist disaster survivors with. Let's go to the next slide. Income and financial issues, and that notes that we will be helping with FEMA and IA disaster denials and appeals. We can go to the next slide. I know we didn't get a chance to touch on family law too much. That may be an upcoming presentation that the bar is going to do, but there are issues that survivors may encounter or that may be compounded after experiencing a disaster. We can help with those as well. Next slide. And then there may be access issues that are encountered when trying to access services and apply for benefits that we can assist with. So there's a large range of services that we can help people with, and we can go to the next slide. That's good news for all of you because that means there's probably an area of law where you already feel comfortable, perhaps volunteering, or that you will feel comfortable with or up for a challenge after attending this or other trainings. If you're already a volunteer with us and you receive emails from Autumn Smith, our pro bono manager, you don't need to do anything else. You'll be informed as we have opportunities to assist disaster survivors. If you have not signed up for us, you can do so. The link is there on the slide. And once we start having a need for volunteers for particular areas, you'll get an email blast about that. If you're a community member who also wants to get involved and volunteer, we do have the Community Justice Worker Program. I think what would be most helpful for disaster survivors is if they're also experiencing SNAP application delays or denials. That's something that you can become a trained community justice worker to assist clients through the fair hearing process. And if you're interested about that, you can fill out our interest form, and the link is on that slide. If you're watching this and not licensed in Alaska, we do have the Alaska Bar Rule 43.6 waiver for out-of-state licensed attorneys to participate in pro bono. And we'd be happy to help you go through that application process. And also, I'm sure Leah would be happy to speak to any out-of-state licensed attorneys as well if you have questions about that. And that is a little bit on Alaska Legal Services, and hopefully some of the 40 people online now, or the many people that'll watch this later on YouTube or the bar website, will be interested in volunteering and will get in touch. I'll turn it back over to Leah. Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. So we've got about 5 minutes left. So we did have some questions in the chat that we didn't yet get to. And if you have other questions, we'll try to get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. So the first one I saw that did not get yet answered was, are the trailers purchased using grant funds and owned by the individual or applicable government, or are they more loaned by FEMA for temporary use?
They're loaned by FEMA for temporary use. And like we said, they are, if the state or tribal government requests them, they may bring them in, and the survivors will be able to stay in them for a certain period of time. But after 18 months, if they're still there, FEMA might start charging rent. And this can get pushed back. After Hurricane Ida, we had a lot of housing issues, and our legal aid providers and we all signed on to various letters asking them to push this back several times, the putting in for rent, but eventually they did start charging rent.
Okay, and then there was another question, can damage to airplanes be covered by individual assistance?
I'm gonna say I doubt very seriously, because I don't think an airplane, there's commercial flights in and out of a community, so I'd probably say no. but maybe Caitlin has, or Amelia have a different thought, but I doubt very seriously an airplane would be considered that type of transportation.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, honestly though, I would try.
Yeah.
I'm that guy though. I'm like, oh, why not? Like, I mean, try and make an argument. Like, I mean, it hasn't, not that it, the fact that it hasn't been done before doesn't mean that it shouldn't
Yeah.
set a precedent.
All right, and then the next question, which I think was partially answered, what if the head of household did not include an adult household member on the application?
You can go ahead and like amend the application and ask that they add them to the application. And if that doesn't work, have them file a separate application for their, if it's their personal property assistance or other personal property.
All right, and I did speak with Katie Soden at the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault about issues relevant to survivors of domestic violence. And one thing that she pointed out is that, you know, they might not feel safe applying separately as a separate, you know, as a household member, but that there is, you know, just sort of the usual remedies that survivors of domestic violence can get for spousal support, child custody support through the domestic violence protective order process or through the divorce process. And she also linked, and we can share the information, the phone numbers for the various shelters throughout the state that might also be able to help with that.
I do see a question that someone asked if an applicant has to assert the information in the application is true, and yes, you do. And that is for anytime anyone is submitting information to a FEMA or you're submitting the appeal, you have to assert that the information is true.
And as to Anne's question about our shipping costs for repair materials or replacement items, yes, that is part of the cost that you can assert. That became an issue last with Typhoon Murbach because the costs were so high that FEMA was underestimating those costs, but hopefully they've got that right this time. But yes, those costs of getting things out to remote Alaska can be included as part of your loss.
They actually removed the requirement to sign anything under the penalty of perjury when they did the amendments to make appeals easier a couple years ago. So they don't need to do that big language anymore.
Is that just for the appeal or also for the application?
For appeals in the beginning, if you're doing an appeal, they would not accept it unless you had actually like a line item that says that I certify under penalty of perjury that everything is true and correct, etc. That's no longer a requirement.
Yeah. So yeah, so that goes hand in hand with there's no longer a requirement for that appeal letter.
Application.
All right, well, I think that is our time. So I wanted to just thank our speakers, Caitlin Morgenstern, Amelia Hoppy, Dr. Cheryl Musgrove, and Joy Anderson, and also thank our co-sponsors, Emergency Legal Responders, the Alaska Institute for Justice, and Alaska Legal Services Corporation. And thank you all for attending. Please do encourage your friends and colleagues to watch this CLE through the video on demand library. We will also be posting it to YouTube through the Alaska Bar Association's YouTube channel so that we can reach even more people. And again, we encourage everyone to volunteer with Alaska Free Legal Answers or Alaska Legal Services Corporation and sign up for the pro bono mailing list to be notified about clinics as well. And I'll ask the speakers to just stay on for a moment and say goodnight to everyone else. Thank you.